Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
Watch that boy shit, redneck. You talking to the sheriff of Rock Ridge.
Hashtag Gene Wilder finally reveals what most fans never figured out about Blazing Saddles. There is a moment in Blazing Saddles that almost every fan has seen dozens of times, and almost every fan has completely misunderstood. It happens quietly, without fanfare, in the middle of a film that never stops screaming for your attention. A man sits in a jail cell, barely moving, barely speaking, and somehow, in all that stillness, he becomes the most interesting person on screen. Most people laugh at that moment and move on. But Gene Wilder, the man who created it, later revealed that what audiences were laughing at was only the surface. Underneath it was something far more deliberate, far more personal, and far more technically brilliant than anyone gave it credit for. Once you understand what Wilder was actually doing in that role, you will never watch Blazing Saddles the same way again. Mel Brooks made a movie in 1974 that was designed to be loud, confrontational, and relentlessly outrageous. He wanted audiences uncomfortable and laughing at the same time. He wanted to expose the mythology of the American West as a fantasy built on racism, cowardice, and self-delusion. To do that, he surrounded his story with enormous, cartoonish performances, characters that practically leaped off the screen and grabbed you by the collar. And right in the middle of all that noise, Gene Wilder decided to do almost nothing. That decision turned out to be the most radical creative choice in the entire film. The story of how Wilder ended up in Blazing Saddles at all is one of Hollywood's more remarkable last-minute rescues. The role of the Waco Kid had originally been given to Gig Young, an Oscar-winning actor with serious dramatic credentials. Young seemed like an ideal choice on paper. He had the kind of weathered dignity the role seemed to call for, and his history in Hollywood gave him immediate authority on screen. But on the very first day of principal photography, something went terribly wrong. Young appeared on set visibly unwell. He was shaking, disoriented, and unable to deliver his lines coherently. The production team quickly realized this was not a performance choice. Young was in the grip of acute alcohol withdrawal, a medical emergency serious enough that he collapsed before the morning was over. Filming stopped. The studio had a crisis on its hands, and Mel Brooks had a film with no leading man for one of its central roles. Brooks did not call his agent. He did not put out a casting notice or negotiate with a talent agency. He picked up the phone and called Gene Wilder directly. The two men had already built a creative relationship on the producers several years earlier, and Brooks trusted Wilder in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. What happened next says a great deal about the kind of person Wilder was. According to Brooks, Wilder did not ask to read the script. He did not ask about salary, billing, or shooting schedules. He simply said yes and got on a plane. He arrived on set within 24 hours, jet-lagged, underprepared in the conventional sense, and completely ready to work. That instinct to show up, to trust the collaboration and figure out the details later, was characteristic of how Wilder approached his entire career. What Wilder did once he arrived, however, was not what anyone expected. He came with one condition, and it was a condition that might have alarmed a different director. Wilder told Brooks that he was not going to play the Waco Kid for laughs. In a film that was aggressively, unapologetically comedic at every level, the actor stepping into one of its central roles was insisting on playing his character as though the comedy was almost beside the point. Brooks, to his enormous credit, understood immediately what Wilder was offering. He agreed, and that agreement changed everything about how the film ultimately worked. To understand why this was such an unusual choice, you have to understand what comedic performance looked like in Hollywood at that time. The dominant mode in broad-screen comedy was extroversion. Actors pushed. They mugged. They signaled their jokes to the audience with timing that was designed to be unmissable, practically putting up a sign that read, "Laugh here." Even genuinely talented comic actors of the era tended toward exaggeration, toward performances that were bigger than life. Wilder looked at all of that and went in the opposite direction. He chose understatement in a film built entirely on overstatement. He chose stillness in a film that never sat still. He chose to play a man who had genuinely been broken by life, and to play that brokenness with honesty rather than irony. The Waco Kid, as Wilder constructed him, is not a comic character pretending to be tragic. He is a tragic character existing inside a comic world. The distinction matters enormously. When the kid explains his trembling hands to Sheriff Bart in that jail cell, Wilder does not wink at the audience. He does not let you know that he knows this is funny. He plays the scene as though the humiliation and loss behind that explanation are real, because for the character, they are. The laughs come, but they arrive with a strange aftertaste, something between amusement and sympathy that most comedy of that era never attempted to produce. Wilder understood that the joke lands harder when the pain underneath it is genuine, even in a parody. This was not an accident of performance. It was a philosophy Wilder had developed over years of thinking carefully about what comedy actually does to an audience. He believed that the funniest characters were almost always the ones carrying the heaviest weight. Comedy, in his view, was not about escape from seriousness. It was about finding the absurdity within seriousness, and to do that authentically, you had to take the seriousness seriously first. The Waco Kid drinks because something in him broke. What broke, exactly, is never fully spelled out, and Wilder wisely never fills in those blanks with pantomime or easy exposition. He simply carries the weight of it, and lets the audience feel that weight without being told what it is. Mel Brooks later spoke about Wilder's contribution in ways that made clear he saw it as foundational rather than supplemental. Without the emotional grounding that Wilder provided, the film's satire risked becoming merely savage. Blazing Saddles is asking serious questions about American racism, about the mythology of the frontier, about how communities construct heroes and villains to protect their own self-image. Those questions land harder because there is someone on screen who seems to feel the weight of them, even while the film is technically busy being a comedy. The Waco Kid, in Wilder's hands, becomes the film's conscience by default, not through speeches or moral pronouncements, but simply through the quality of his attention. One of the more fascinating aspects of how Wilder worked on this film involves what happened when the cameras were not rolling. By all accounts from people who were present during production, Wilder became an informal stabilizing force on a set that had plenty of reasons to become chaotic. Brooks ran the production with tremendous creative energy, but that energy was inherently unpredictable. The studio was nervous. The material was provocative in ways that made executives genuinely anxious. The cast was large, and the comedy was often improvised or pushed in new directions day by day. In the middle of all of that, Wilder was calm. He helped younger actors with their timing, not in a formal or hierarchical way, but through the kind of quiet, specific suggestion that comes from someone who has thought deeply about the craft. People who worked with him on that production have described him as an anchor, someone whose steadiness made the surrounding uncertainty feel manageable. It was during this same production that something remarkable happened off-screen. In the downtime between setups, Wilder began talking to Brooks about an idea that had been forming in his mind. What if the descendant of the famous Dr. Frankenstein wanted desperately to have nothing to do with that legacy? What if he found the family history embarrassing, even shameful, and was forced by circumstance back into a world he had tried to leave behind? Brooks was initially dismissive. He had a film to finish, and it was already consuming most of his available creative bandwidth. But Wilder kept returning to the idea, and eventually he wrote a draft on his own, without a deal in place, without a guarantee that anything would come of it. When Brooks finally read what Wilder had written, he changed his mind quickly. That conversation, that seed of an idea planted in the downtime of one production, became Young Frankenstein, which many people consider the finest work either man ever made. The fact that it grew directly out of Blazing Saddles, out of a collaboration that was itself born from a crisis, says something important about how creative partnerships actually work when they are functioning at their best. There is also a dimension of Wilder's work on Blazing Saddles that deserves more attention than it typically receives, and that is his role in the film's battles with the studio. Warner Brothers was deeply uncomfortable with much of what Brooks was making. Executives pushed for changes, for softened language, for scenes that addressed American racism less directly and more carefully. The studio's anxiety was not entirely irrational. This was genuinely provocative material, and the people financing it had legitimate concerns about audience reaction. But Wilder supported Brooks's refusal to compromise the film's central argument. He understood that Blazing Saddles derived its power specifically from its willingness to make audiences uncomfortable. Satire that pulls its punches stops being satire. It becomes something gentler and far less useful. Wilder did not make this case loudly or combatively. He simply made clear, in the conversations that mattered, that he believed in what Brooks was doing and that diluting it would be a mistake. That support, coming from someone with Wilder's reputation and track record, carried genuine weight. Thinking about the performances that were nearly lost is also worth a moment's reflection. Richard Pryor had been deeply involved in writing Blazing Saddles and had been championed by Brooks to play Sheriff Bart. The two had already developed a remarkable creative understanding through the writing process, and Pryor's fingerprints are all over the film's comedic rhythm and its unsparing engagement with race. But studio executives blocked his casting, citing concerns about his public profile at the time. Cleavon Little stepped into the role and delivered a genuinely extraordinary performance. But Wilder, in later years, reflected honestly on what might have been. He and Pryor would eventually work together on Silver Streak and Stir Crazy, and those collaborations produced some of the most beloved comedy of the late 70s and early 80s. Had Pryor been in Blazing Saddles, that partnership would have begun years earlier, in a film already defined by its willingness to challenge everything comfortable about mainstream Hollywood comedy. The scenes of Wilder's that never made it into the final cut are their own small mystery. People who were present during filming have described longer sequences that went deeper into the Waco Kid's backstory, moments that explored with more detail what he had lost and what he was still grieving. These scenes were cut not because they failed, but because the film's pacing could not accommodate them. What remains on screen is already more emotionally layered than most audiences realize. What was left on the editing room floor, by all accounts, pushed that layering even further. The question of whether those scenes would have deepened the film or slowed it down is genuinely unanswerable, but their existence confirms something important about how seriously Wilder took the role. He was not showing up to deliver lines in a comedy. He was building a person. There is something in Wilder's approach to the Waco Kid that feels particularly relevant when you think about what great comedy actually requires. The instinct in broad comic filmmaking is always to add, to push further, to escalate the gag until it breaks through whatever resistance the audience has left. Wilder's instinct was to subtract, to find out what happened when you removed the signal that something was funny and trusted the audience to find it on their own. That trust is rarer than it sounds. Most performers, and most directors, are afraid to leave that kind of space. The silence might not get filled. The audience might not follow you into the quiet. Wilder believed they would, and in Blazing Saddles, he was right. The film's selection for preservation by the Library of Congress reflects something real about how it has aged. Not every comedy from 1974 is still being watched, still being argued about, still feeling urgent and strange and genuinely surprising. Blazing Saddles is, and part of the reason for that is that it contains within it something more durable than its loudest jokes. It contains Wilder's Waco Kid, sitting quietly at the center of the storm, carrying something real, making the chaos around him mean something more than it otherwise would. Gene Wilder was not trying to steal the film. He was trying to hold it together. And in doing so, without ever announcing that this was what he was doing, he created one of the most enduring comic performances in American film history. A performance built not on what it showed you, but on what it suggested. Not on what it said, but on what it left unsaid. Not on the joke itself, but on the weight of everything that made the joke necessary in the first place. That is the thing most fans never quite figured out, and it was hiding in plain sight the entire time.